On Christmas morning, 1992, the Peterson family of Cedar Falls, Minnesota, sat down to open presents beneath their decorated tree. By noon, every single one of them had vanished without a trace. No bodies were ever found. No ransom was ever demanded. The house remained undisturbed, the Christmas dinner still warm in the oven. For 30 years, their disappearance remained one of the most baffling mysteries in American history. But last month, a demolition crew preparing to tear down the old Peterson house made a discovery that would finally reveal the horrifying truth about what happened that Christmas day. This is the story of the family that vanished on Christmas and the nightmare that was hiding in plain sight for 3 decades. If you're fascinated by true crime mysteries and unsolved cases, subscribe now. You won't believe where this leads. The photographs were spread across Detective Sarah Chen's desk, like pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit together. Michael Peterson, age 42, a respected high school chemistry teacher with wire-rimmed glasses and a gentle smile. His wife, Helen, 39, a pediatric nurse known for her warmth and dedication. Their 3 children, 17-year-old Emma, a straight-A student with dreams of studying medicine, 14-year-old Jacob, a quiet boy who loved astronomy, and 9-year-old Lily, whose gap-toothed grin had once graced the front page of every newspaper in the state. Sarah had been a rookie patrol officer when the Petersons disappeared. She remembered the frantic calls on December 25th, the spirit searches through snow-covered woods, the candlelight vigils that stretched through the following year. She remembered Helen's sister, Carol, who had driven through a blizzard to deliver Christmas gifts, only to find the house empty, the front door unlocked, and a silence so complete it seemed to swallow sound itself. 30 years later, Sarah was the lead detective in the Cedar Falls Police Department's cold case unit. She had returned to the Peterson file dozens of times over the decades, always hoping for that one overlooked detail, that single thread that might unravel the mystery. The file had grown thick with theories: murder-suicide, though no bodies were found; kidnapping, though no ransom came; voluntary disappearance, though the family had left behind wallets, medications, and a life that showed no signs of distress. Now, with the demolition scheduled for next week, she had one final chance to walk through the house where it all began. The current owner, a property development company, had agreed to delay the teardown by 72 hours. Sarah gathered the photographs, returned them to the folder, and stood from her desk. Outside her office window, snow was beginning to fall, just as it had 3 decades ago. She pulled on her coat and headed for the door, unaware that within the walls of the Peterson house, something had been waiting all these years to be found. The Peterson house stood at the end of Maple Ridge Drive, a 2-story colonial that had once been painted cheerful yellow, but now wore its age in peeling strips and weathered gray wood. Sarah parked her sedan at the curb, studying the structure through the light snowfall. The neighboring houses had been updated over the years, their facades refreshed with modern siding and landscaping. The Peterson house alone remained frozen in time, a monument to abandonment. Carol Hoffman, Helen Peterson's sister, sat in the passenger seat. She was 68 now, her hair silver, her face lined with decades of grief and unanswered questions. She had called Sarah 3 days ago, after hearing about the planned demolition, begging for one final walk through the house before it was reduced to rubble. "I haven't been inside since that day," Carol said quietly, her breath fogging the window. "The police kept it sealed for years during the investigation. After they released it, I couldn't bring myself to go back. I hired someone to pack up the belongings, sold everything. The house itself, no one wanted it. Too much history. Too many questions." Sarah nodded, understanding the weight of those unspoken horrors. Houses where tragedies occurred carried a stigma that no amount of renovation could erase. The Peterson house had eventually been purchased by a property investment group for a fraction of its value, then left to deteriorate, while the company waited for the neighborhood's property values to rise enough to justify development. They climbed out of the car and approached the front porch. The steps creaked beneath their weight, and Sarah noticed that several boards had rotted through completely. The front door, once a deep burgundy, had faded to rust. She produced a key provided by the development company and unlocked the door. The smell hit them first. Not decay exactly, but a musty staleness, the scent of air that had been trapped and recycled for 3 decades. Sarah clicked on her flashlight, its beam cutting through the dimness. The electricity had been shut off years ago. The entryway opened into a living room that still contained furniture covered in white sheets, ghostly shapes in the half-light. A Christmas tree, long dead and skeletal, stood in the corner near the front window. Ornaments still hung from its brittle branches, faded and dust-covered. Beneath it, wrapped presents remained exactly where they had been placed 30 years ago. Carol made a small sound in her throat, somewhere between a gasp and a sob. Sarah placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "We don't have to do this," Sarah said. "I can go through the house alone." "No," Carol replied, her voice steadier than Sarah expected. "I need to see it. I need to understand." They moved deeper into the house. The kitchen was exactly as described in the original police reports. A Christmas dinner for 6, laid out on the table. The food long since dedicated to dust and mold. The oven door stood open, revealing the skeletal remains of what had once been a roasted turkey. Plates were set with precision, silverware arranged just so, glasses positioned at each place setting. Helen was meticulous about dinner presentation, Carol said, running her finger along the dusty table without actually touching it. She always said that meals were about more than food. They were about family, about connection. She would have wanted everything perfect for Christmas dinner. Sarah photographed the scene with her phone, though she knew similar photos already existed in the case file. Something about seeing it with her own eyes felt different, more immediate. She moved to the refrigerator and opened it. Empty, except for condiments and a few shriveled vegetables, nothing unusual. They climbed the stairs to the second floor, each step producing a groan from wood that had been settling for decades. The master bedroom revealed clothes still hanging in the closet, a book on the nightstand open to page 147, reading glasses perched atop it. Helen's jewelry box sat on the dresser untouched. The children's rooms were worse. Emma's walls were covered with college brochures and posters of bands popular in the early 90s. Jacob's telescope stood by his window, aimed at a sky he would never observe again. Lily's room was the explosion of pink and purple, stuffed animals arranged on her bed with childish care. Carol stood in the doorway of Lily's room, tears streaming silently down her face. She was so excited about Christmas. She'd been counting down the days since Thanksgiving. Helen told me Lily had been awake at 5 in the morning, begging to open presents. Sarah said nothing, giving Carol the space to grieve. She had seen this pattern countless times in her career. The way certain objects, certain spaces, could unlock floodgates of emotion that had been carefully contained for years. As Carol composed herself, Sarah noticed something odd about Lily's room. The closet door was slightly ajar, but the space beyond was completely dark, darker than it should have been, even accounting for the lack of electricity. She crossed the room and pulled the door fully open. The closet was deep, extending back much farther than a typical bedroom closet should. Sarah's flashlight beam disappeared into the darkness without revealing a back wall. She stepped inside, pushing past small dresses and coats that smelled of mothballs and thyme. The closet seemed to continue for 8 feet, then 10. Sarah's pulse quickened. This wasn't right. The house's exterior dimensions didn't allow for a closet this deep. She reached the back wall finally and ran her hands across it. Wood paneling, solid and unremarkable. But when she knocked on it, the sound was hollow. "Carol," she called out. "Come look at this." Carol appeared in the closet doorway, her silhouette backlit by the gray light filtering through Lily's bedroom window. Sarah was running her hands methodically across the back wall of the closet, searching for seams or irregularities in the wood paneling. "What is it?" Carol asked, stepping carefully over shoes and storage boxes that had been undisturbed for 3 decades. "This closet is too deep," Sarah replied, her fingers finding a vertical gap in the paneling. "Based on the house's exterior dimensions, there should only be about 4 feet of depth here. But I've walked at least 12 feet back, and I'm still inside the house's footprint." She pressed against the panel, and something clicked. A section of the wall, roughly 3 feet wide and 6 feet tall, swung inward with a groan of protest from hinges that hadn't moved in decades. Cold air rushed out, carrying a smell that made both women instinctively step back. It wasn't the smell of death. Not exactly. Sarah had encountered that particular odor enough times to recognize it immediately. This was something else, something older and more complex. Dust, certainly, and dampness. But underneath those expected scents was something chemical, almost medicinal. Sarah aimed her flashlight through the opening. A narrow staircase descended into darkness, the steps wooden and steep. She pulled out her phone and dialed the police station. "This is Detective Chen. I need a forensics team and backup at 1247 Maple Ridge Drive. I've found a concealed space in the Peterson house." She paused, listening to the dispatcher's response. "No, I haven't gone down yet. I'm waiting for support. ETA 15 minutes. Good." She ended the call and turned to Carol, who was staring at the hidden staircase with an expression that mingled hope and horror in equal measure. "They could be down there," Carol whispered. "After all this time, they could be down there." Sarah wanted to offer comfort, to temper expectations, but she had learned long ago that false hope was crueler than honest uncertainty. Instead, she placed a hand on Carol's arm and guided her back toward the bedroom. "Let's wait upstairs for the team," Sarah said. "This is now an active crime scene. We need to preserve whatever evidence might be present." They returned to the living room, and Sarah used the time to examine the space more carefully. Now that she knew about the hidden area, other details began to stand out. The house's floor plan had always seemed slightly off, with rooms that felt smaller than their dimensions suggested. She pulled up the original architectural plans on her phone, documents that had been scanned into the case file decades ago. According to the plans filed with the city in 1967 when the house was built, there was no hidden space, no concealed staircase. But as Sarah traced the measurements, she realized that approximately 200 square feet of the house's interior was unaccounted for in the official layout. Someone had built that hidden space deliberately, either during original construction or in a renovation that had never been properly permitted or documented. The sound of vehicles arriving pulled her attention to the window. 2 patrol cars and a forensics van parked along the curb. Sarah met them at the door, briefing Officer Marcus Webb and his partner, while the forensics team, led by Diane Cho, began unloading their equipment. "The hidden door is in the youngest child's bedroom closet," Sarah explained. "As they climb the stairs, it opens onto a staircase leading down. I haven't descended yet. No idea what's below. Diane, a veteran forensics specialist who had worked the original Peterson case as a junior technician, set up portable lights in Lily's room. The sudden brightness was jarring after the dimness, revealing details that the flashlight had missed. Water stains on the ceiling, a crack in the window glass, the way dust had settled in uniform layers across every surface except one, a small path leading from the door to the closet, as if someone had walked this route regularly. Sarah felt her pulse quicken as she noticed that detail. The dust pattern suggested the path had been created after the family's disappearance, which meant someone had been in this house, accessing that hidden space, while everyone believed the property was sealed and empty. "Look at this," she said, pointing out the disturbance to Diane. "Someone's been coming here." Diane photographed the evidence, then used a portable vacuum to collect dust samples from the disturbed and undisturbed areas. "I can get this analyzed for timeline dating," she said. "Might tell us when this path was created." With lights now positioned to illuminate the hidden staircase, the team gathered at the closet's back wall. Sarah could see that the stairs descended at a steep angle, roughly 40 degrees, and appeared to be constructed of rough lumber rather than the finished wood used in the rest of the house. The walls on either side were bare studs with no insulation or drywall. "I'll go first," Sarah said, pulling on latex gloves. Officer Webb moved to accompany her, his hand resting on his service weapon. The stairs creaked under their weight, each step producing an echo that seemed to travel down and down, farther than should have been possible. The staircase made what 90-degree turn, then continued descending. Sarah counted 23 steps before her feet touched level ground. Her flashlight beam swept across a space that made her breath catch in her throat. She was standing in a basement, but not the unfinished crawl space she had expected. This was a carefully constructed room, roughly 30 feet by 20 feet, with finished walls and a concrete floor. But it was the contents of the room that caused Officer Webb to swear softly behind her. Against one wall stood a series of tables, their surfaces covered with laboratory equipment. Beakers, burners, tubes of chemicals arranged with meticulous care. A periodic table was pinned to the wall, certain elements circled in red marker. Along another wall, filing cabinets stood in a neat row, each drawer labeled with dates spanning from 1988 to 1992. But it was the far corner of the room that drew Sarah's attention and held it with magnetic horror. A hospital gurney sat in the shadows, its surface fitted with leather restraints at the head, wrists, and ankles. Beside it, a table held medical instruments arranged on a sterile cloth, scalpels, syringes, and other tools Sarah couldn't immediately identify. "Jesus Christ," Webb breathed. "What is this place?" Sarah moved to the filing cabinets, her mind racing to catalog and understand what they had discovered. She pulled open the top drawer of the first cabinet. Inside were files, dozens of them, each labeled with dates and titles that made her stomach clench. Subject response to Compound 7, Behavioral Modifications Week 12, Memory Suppression Protocol Revision 3. She opened one file at random. Inside were detailed notes, written in precise handwriting, clinical observations about subject responses to various chemical compounds. But it was the photographs paper-clipped to the notes that confirmed her worst fears. The subjects were the Peterson children, Emma, Jacob, and Lily, photographed at various stages, their eyes vacant and unfocused, their expressions slack. In some photos, they sat at a table in what appeared to be this very basement, completing puzzles or reading books, while electrodes were attached to their heads. In others, they lay on the gurney, secured by the leather restraints, while someone off-camera administered injections. Sarah's hands trembled as she flipped through image after image. The dates on the files indicated these experiments had been ongoing for years before the family's disappearance. The most recent file was dated December 24, 1992, the day before the Petersons vanished. "Detective," Diane called from the stairs. "You need to see this, now." Sarah carefully returned the file to the cabinet and crossed to where Diane stood, her flashlight aimed at something on the wall beside the staircase. In the better light, Sarah could now see what Diane had spotted: a light switch plate, modern and out of place among the rough construction of the hidden space. Diane flipped the switch, and fluorescent lights flickered to life overhead, illuminating the basement in harsh white light. The sudden brightness revealed details that the flashlight had missed. Mounted high on one wall was a security camera, its lens pointed at the gurney. Below it, a small television and VCR were positioned on a shelf, and beside them, a stack of videotapes, each labeled with dates. And in the corner behind the gurney, partially hidden by shadow, even with the lights on, was a door. Its surface was heavy steel, and beside it was mounted a keypad lock, the kind that required a numeric code for entry. Sarah approached the door slowly, each step measured and careful. She tried the handle, expecting it to be locked, but it turned smoothly in her hand. The door opened inward with a whisper of hinges that had been recently oiled, and beyond it, another staircase descended into darkness that the fluorescent lights could not penetrate. The smell that wafted up from below was the same medicinal odor she had noticed when first opening the hidden panel, but stronger now, concentrated and unmistakable. And beneath it, finally, was the scent she had been dreading since the moment she discovered this place: the sweet, rotting smell of death. Sarah stood at the threshold of the steel door, her flashlight beam swallowed by the darkness below. Officer Webb had called for additional backup, and within minutes, the house was filled with personnel. More forensics technicians, the police chief, and a team from the county medical examiner's office. Chief Raymond Torres arrived with Detective Marcus Liu, a specialist in cold cases who had consulted on the Peterson investigation during its initial phase. Torres took one look at the laboratory setup and the filing cabinets, then turned to Sarah with an expression that mixed vindication with grief. "Michael Peterson," he said quietly. "It was Michael all along." Sarah had reached the same conclusion. Michael Peterson, the beloved chemistry teacher, had built this laboratory beneath his own home and had been conducting experiments on his own children. The discovery recontextualized everything they thought they knew about the family's disappearance. "We need to see what's down those stairs," Sarah said, gesturing to the steel door. "But we need to be prepared for what we might find." The medical examiner, Dr. Patricia Gomez, approached with her team. She was a woman in her 50s, with steel-gray hair and the calm demeanor of someone who had spent decades confronting death in its various forms. She nodded to Sarah, then moved to examine the gurney and medical instruments. "This equipment is pharmaceutical grade," she observed, picking up one of the syringes with a gloved hand. "And these restraints show significant wear patterns. They were used repeatedly over an extended period." Sarah opened another filing cabinet, while the ME continued her examination. These files contained financial records, credit card statements showing purchases from medical supply companies, canceled checks made out to chemical suppliers, and receipts for construction materials dated from 1987, 5 years before the disappearance. One document in particular caught her attention: a letter from the school board dated October 1992, informing Michael Peterson that his contract would not be renewed for the following academic year due to concerns raised by parents about his increasingly erratic behavior in the classroom. Several students had reported that Mr. Peterson seemed distracted, sometimes stopping mid-lecture to stare at nothing, occasionally making comments that suggested he was holding conversations with people who weren't there. Sarah photographed the letter and continued through the files. She found a journal, its pages filled with Michael's handwriting, the script becoming progressively more erratic as the entries progressed. The early entries, dating from 1988, were clinical and detailed, describing his theories about memory modification and behavioral conditioning. He wrote about his desire to prove that human consciousness could be fundamentally altered through the right combination of chemical intervention and psychological manipulation. But as the entries continued, the tone shifted. Michael began writing about voices he heard, instructions he received from what he called the collective understanding. He described visions of a perfect family, one freed from the limitations of individual will, united in a single purpose that he never quite articulated clearly. The final entry, dated December 24, 1992, was barely legible. Tomorrow we transcend. Tomorrow we become what we were always meant to be. The basement will be our chrysalis. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. She handed the journal to Chief Torres, who read through it with deepening concern. "We need to go down those stairs," Torres said finally. "Whatever happened to this family? The answer is down there." Dr. Gomez and her team went first, followed by Sarah, Officer Webb, and Detective Liu. The staircase was newer than the one leading from Lily's closet, constructed with concrete steps and metal railings. It descended in a straight line for what Sarah estimated was at least 15 feet, taking them well below the house's foundation level. The stairs ended at a corridor, narrow and lined with cinder block walls painted white. The fluorescent lights overhead were motion-activated, flickering to life as the team moved forward. The medicinal smell was stronger here, mixed with something else that Sarah recognized as formaldehyde. The corridor extended for roughly 30 feet before opening into a larger space. As they emerged from the hallway, Dr. Gomez stopped so abruptly that Sarah nearly collided with her. The medical examiner stood frozen, staring at what lay before them. The room was circular, approximately 40 feet in diameter, with a domed ceiling that rose to a point 15 feet above their heads. The walls were lined with hospital beds, 5 in total, arranged like points on a star. Each bed was occupied. Sarah moved closer, her heart pounding. The bodies were preserved, not through natural mummification, but through deliberate chemical treatment. She could see the tubes and apparatus that had been used to infuse the bodies with preservative, the same process used in anatomical specimen preparation. Michael Peterson lay in the first bed, his hands folded across his chest. His face was peaceful, almost serene, his skin waxy and discolored from the preservation process, but features still clearly recognizable from the photographs Sarah had studied for 30 years. In the next bed was Helen Peterson, positioned identically to her husband. Her nurse's uniform was still intact, and around her neck was a gold locket that Sarah knew from the case files contained pictures of her 3 children. The 3 remaining beds held Emma, Jacob, and Lily. They were arranged by age, Emma closest to her parents, then Jacob, and finally Lily, at the far point of the star formation. Each child was dressed in pajamas, and each had been positioned with the same care as their parents, hands folded, expressions peaceful. Dr. Gomez approached the bed slowly, examining each body with professional detachment, even as her hands trembled slightly. "The preservation is remarkable," she said, her voice clinical to mask emotion. This was done immediately after death, possibly even during the dying process to ensure maximum tissue integrity." Sarah noticed that each bed had an IV stand beside it, the bags long empty, but the tubing still in place, running to needles inserted in the subject's arms. On a table in the center of the circular room sat a leather-bound book, its cover embossed with a symbol Sarah didn't recognize. She opened the book carefully. Inside, in Michael Peterson's increasingly unhinged handwriting, was what could only be described as a manifesto. He had documented his final plan in meticulous detail. According to Michael's account, he had spent years perfecting a chemical compound that he believed would allow consciousness to separate from the body and merge with what he called the universal mind. His experiments on his children had been preparation, attempts to condition their minds to accept the transition he planned for Christmas Day. On Christmas morning, while the family opened presents, Michael had administered what he believed would be the final, perfected version of his compound, mixed into their orange juice at breakfast. He wrote that they would open gifts together one last time, then descend to this chamber where they would undergo the transcendence as a family unit. The journal described how Helen had been the first to realize something was wrong. She had confronted Michael in the kitchen, demanding to know what he had given them. The children were becoming disoriented, and Emma had complained of numbness in her extremities. Michael wrote that he tried to explain his vision, the beautiful future he had planned for them, but Helen had called him insane and reached for the phone to call for help. There was a gap in the narrative here, several pages torn out. When the writing resumed, Michael described carrying his family members one by one down to this chamber. He wrote that the compound had worked too well, that they had transcended before he could complete the proper rituals. In his delusional state, he had convinced himself they were waiting for him in the universal consciousness, and he had carefully preserved their bodies as vessels that they might someday return to. The final entry was brief. I have failed to transcend with them. The compound does not work on me as it should. I am too corrupted by doubt, but I can still join them in death, and perhaps in death. I will find the door I could not open in life. Sarah closed the book and looked at the 5 beds, at the family that had been stolen from the world by one man's descent into madness. She thought of Carol upstairs, waiting for news, hoping against hope that somehow her sister and nieces and nephew had survived. There's more, Officer Webb called from the far side of the chamber. He was standing beside what appeared to be a workshop area, complete with tools and construction supplies. On the wall above it was a detailed architectural drawing, a blueprint for the hidden basement and this preservation chamber. He built all of this himself, Webb said, studying the drawings. Started in 1987 according to these dates. Took him 5 years to complete. Sarah joined him, examining the blueprints. They showed not just the chambers they had already discovered, but additional rooms, spaces they hadn't yet explored. According to the plans, there was another corridor leading off from this circular chamber, extending deeper into the earth. Where does that lead? Sarah asked, pointing to the corridor marked on the blueprint. Webb traced the line with his finger. If these dimensions are accurate, it extends about 50 feet northwest, taking it beyond the property line and under the neighboring yard. They found the corridor entrance hidden behind a false wall panel. Unlike the other passages they had discovered, this one was unfinished. The walls bare earth, shored up with timber supports. The floor was dirt, and the passage was barely 5 feet high, forcing them to crouch as they moved forward. The tunnel ended at a wooden door, crude and hastily constructed, compared to the careful craftsmanship evident in the rest of Michael's construction. Sarah pushed it open and found herself in another basement, this one clearly belonging to a different house. Stairs led upward, and Sarah could see daylight filtering down from above. They climbed the stairs and emerged into the kitchen of 1251 Maple Ridge Drive. the house directly behind the Peterson property. The kitchen was empty, the house clearly vacant, but recent. There were still dishes in the sink, mail on the counter dated from 2 weeks ago. The neighbor's house, Detective Liu said, checking the address on an envelope. According to our records, this property is owned by a Gerald Vance. He's been renting it out for the past 8 years. Sarah felt pieces clicking into place. Someone's been using this tunnel. Someone who had access to this house, who could come and go through the Peterson property without being seen from the street. The discovery of the tunnel complicated everything. Chief Torres immediately ordered a canvass of the neighborhood, looking for anyone who might have seen suspicious activity at either property. Detective Liu began pulling rental records for the Vance house, tracking down every tenant who had lived there over the past 30 years. Sarah returned to the circular chamber, where Dr. Gomez and her team were carefully documenting the scene before the bodies could be moved. The medical examiner had confirmed that all 5 family members had died from poisoning, the specific compound still to be determined through toxicology testing. But the symptoms described in Michael's journal matched known effects of certain psychoactive alkaloids combined with cardiac suppressants. He murdered them, Dr. Gomez said quietly, her usual clinical detachment cracking slightly. Convinced himself he was elevating them to some higher plane of existence, but he simply murdered his wife and children, then took his own life when he realized what he'd done. Sarah nodded, though she suspected Michael's final moments had been more complex than simple realization of his crime. The evidence suggested he had spent considerable time after their deaths, carefully preserving the bodies and arranging them in this chamber, before finally administering a fatal dose to himself. His body showed signs of the same preservation process, which meant he must have set up some kind of automated system to preserve himself after death. Carol was waiting in the living room upstairs, her face drawn with exhaustion and dread. She looked up as Sarah emerged from Lily's closet, and the expression on Sarah's face told her everything she needed to know before any words were spoken. "They're dead," Carol said, not a question, but a statement of fact she had perhaps always known. "All of them?" "Yes," Sarah confirmed gently. "I'm so sorry, Carol. We found them in a hidden chamber below the house. It appears Michael poisoned the family on Christmas morning, then took his own life." Carol closed her eyes, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "I knew something was wrong with him those last few months. Helen told me he was acting strangely, talking about experiments and transcendence. I thought he was just stressed about work. The school board was investigating him for some incident with a student." Sarah sat beside her, giving her space to process. "Did Helen ever mention that Michael had built something in the house? A laboratory or extra rooms?" "No, never. But then, Michael always did home improvement projects. He liked working with his hands. Helen used to joke that he was building them a mansion 1 room at a time." Carol wiped her eyes with a tissue. "When can I see them?" "The medical examiner needs to complete her work first," Sarah explained. "And I should prepare you. The bodies have been preserved, but they're not as you remember them. It might be better to remember them as they were in life." Carol shook her head firmly. "I've waited 30 years. I need to see them. I need to know they're really at peace." Over the next several hours, the house became a hub of investigative activity. The forensics team cataloged thousands of items, the laboratory equipment, the files documenting Michael's experiments, the videotapes that showed his increasingly disturbing sessions with his children. The videos would have to be reviewed as evidence, though Sarah dreaded the task. Detective Liu returned with information about the Vance house's rental history. The current tenant is a man named Robert Chanowski, age 54, Oh, he's been renting the property for 3 years. Before him, there were 4 other tenants, each staying between 6 months and 2 years. We need to find Chanowski, Sarah said. If someone's been accessing that tunnel regularly enough to create a path through the dust, he might know who. Already on it, Lou replied. His workplace says he's been on vacation for the past week, supposed to return tomorrow. We've got officers watching his house in case he comes back early. As the afternoon wore into evening, a crowd had gathered outside the Peterson house. News crews, curious neighbors, and morbid onlookers drawn by the spectacle of a 30-year mystery finally solved. Sarah gave a brief statement to the press, confirming that the Peterson family had been found deceased and that the case was being investigated as a murder-suicide. The bodies were removed after dark, transported in unmarked vans to avoid the media circus. Dr. Gomez promised Sarah a preliminary autopsy report within 48 hours, though the full toxicology analysis would take weeks. Sarah was preparing to leave for the night when Diane Cho approached her with a laptop, her expression troubled. "Detective, I've been reviewing the video footage from those tapes. You need to see this." They sat in Diane's mobile forensics van, parked in the Peterson driveway. Diane queued up a video, dated November 15, 1992, roughly 6 weeks before the family's disappearance. The footage showed the basement laboratory, Michael Peterson standing beside the gurney where Jacob lay, restrained. The boy was conscious but clearly sedated, his eyes unfocused. Michael was talking to someone off camera, his voice animated and excited. "You see the response time? The compound is working faster with each iteration. We're close to the breakthrough." A second voice responded, male and slightly younger than Michael's. "But the side effects, Michael. Look at his pupils. There's clearly neurological damage occurring." "Temporary," Michael insisted. "The brain is adaptable. It will compensate once the compound reaches full efficacy." The camera angle shifted slightly, and Sarah caught a glimpse of the second man's reflection in a glass cabinet, tall, thin, with dark hair and a beard. The image was distorted and brief, but something about the shape of his face struck Sarah as familiar. "Do we have any clearer footage of this person?" Sarah asked. Diane fast-forwarded through several tapes, finding multiple instances of the mysterious partner. In one video from December 10, 1992, the man's face was visible for nearly 30 seconds as he leaned over Emma, who was secure, to the gurney. He was checking her vital signs, while Michael mixed chemicals at the laboratory bench. "Freeze that frame," Sarah instructed. Diane paused the video, and Sarah studied the man's face. He appeared to be in his early 30s, with sharp features and intense eyes. There was something unsettling about his expression, a detachment that went beyond clinical objectivity into something colder, almost predatory. "Can you clean up this image and run it through facial recognition?" Sarah asked. "Already on it," Diane replied. "But preliminary search isn't finding any matches in our database. Whoever this guy is, he's never been arrested or fingerprinted in any jurisdiction we have access to." Sarah watched the rest of the video, noting how the partnership between Michael and this unknown man seemed to function. Michael was clearly the driving force, the true believer in his delusional vision. But the other man played along, encouraging Michael's experiments while occasionally suggesting modifications to the procedures. His involvement seemed calculated, purposeful, though his ultimate goal remained unclear. The final tape was dated December 23, 1992, 2 days before the family's disappearance. Michael and his partner stood in the preservation chamber, which was still under construction at that time. The 5 hospital beds were in place, and Michael was explaining his plan for Christmas Day. We'll all transcend together, Michael said, his voice trembling with emotion, or instability, or both. The compound is finally perfected. Helen and the children don't know yet, but they'll understand when the moment comes. We'll open gifts as a family one final time, and then we'll come down here and begin the process. The other man listened impassively, then asked, "And after? What happens to your work, your research?" "You'll continue it," Michael replied. "I'm leaving you all my notes, all my formulations. You understand the importance of what we've discovered. You'll carry it forward, find others who are ready to transcend." The man nodded slowly. "Of course, your legacy will continue." The video ended there, and the screen going black. Sarah sat in silence, processing what she had just witnessed. Michael Peterson hadn't acted alone. He'd had a partner, someone who not only enabled his delusions, but actively participated in the experiments on the Peterson children. "We need to identify this man," Sarah said. "He's either a witness to multiple homicides or an accessory to them. Either way, he has information we need." Diane began the process of digitally enhancing the clearest images of the mystery man, preparing them for wider distribution. Meanwhile, Sarah returned to the files they had recovered from the laboratory, looking for any reference to Michael's partner. She found it in a contract dated January 1988, buried among the financial records. The document was an agreement between Michael Peterson and someone identified only as RC, stipulating the terms of their collaboration. RC would provide funding for materials and equipment, while Michael would conduct the research and maintain the laboratory. In exchange, RC would have full access to all findings and the right to continue the work if Michael became incapacitated. The signature at the bottom was illegible, just a scrawl of initials that could have been anything. But paperclipped to the contract was a bank statement showing regular deposits into Michael's account from something called Janowski Holdings, LLC. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Janowski, the same last name as the current tenant of the Vance house. It couldn't be coincidence. She called Detective Liu immediately. "The tenant at the Vance property, Robert Janowski. I need everything you can find on him, his full background, employment history, known associates, and I need it now." "I'll pull his rental application," Liu replied. "The landlord should have copies of his ID and references." Within an hour, Sarah had a file on Robert Janowski spread across the hood of her car. According to his rental application, he was 54 years old, worked as a pharmaceutical sales representative, and had no criminal record. His driver's license photo showed a man with graying hair and a neat beard, but the bone structure of his face matched the younger man in the videos. "It's him," Sarah said, showing the photo to Diane. "He's been living in that house for 3 years, with access to the tunnel leading directly to the Peterson property." "But why?" Diane asked. "Michael died 30 years ago. Why would this guy maintain access to the laboratory all this time?" Sarah thought about the contract, about RC's insistence on having rights to continue Michael's work. Because the research didn't end with Michael's death. He's been continuing the experiments. The hunt for Robert Janowski became the department's top priority. Officers staked out his rental property, while detectives traced his movements over the past 3 years. What they discovered painted a disturbing picture of a man who had maintained a careful double life for decades. Sarah stood in the incident command center that had been established at the police station, studying a timeline that Detective Liu had constructed on the whiteboard. Janowski's connection to Michael Peterson stretched back to 1987, when both men had attended a fringe science conference in Chicago focused on consciousness expansion and the potential for chemical manipulation of human awareness. Janowski was a doctoral student at the time, Liu explained, pointing to documentation they had obtained from the conference organizers. His dissertation was rejected by his committee for ethical violations. He'd been conducting unauthorized experiments, using human subjects, specifically homeless individuals he recruited through shelters. How did he avoid prosecution? Sarah asked. The university covered it up to avoid scandal. Chanowski was quietly expelled, his research confiscated and sealed. But apparently he and Michael Peterson connected at that conference and maintained contact. Michael provided the laboratory and subjects, his own children, while Chanowski provided the theoretical framework and funding. Sarah felt sick, thinking about the calculated nature of their partnership. This wasn't just Michael's delusional descent into madness. It was a collaboration between two men who had deliberately chosen to experiment on children, justifying their actions with pseudo-scientific theories about consciousness and transcendence. What happened to Chanowski after Michael's death? Sarah asked. Liu flipped through his notes. That's where it gets interesting. For about 5 years after the Petersons disappeared, Chanowski seems to have gone dormant. No rental history, no employment records, nothing. Then, in 1998, he resurfaces in Florida, using his real name, working as a pharmaceutical sales rep. He moves around every few years. Florida, Texas, Arizona, and finally back here to Minnesota in 2020. Right around the time the Peterson house was scheduled for demolition the first time, Sarah noted. The development company announced their intention to tear it down in 2019, then delayed for financial reasons. Chanowski showed up the following year and rented the house directly behind the property. He couldn't let the laboratory be destroyed, Diane Cho added, joining them at the whiteboard. He needed access to Michael's research notes, the preserved bodies, something. Sarah's phone buzzed with an incoming call from Officer Webb, who was part of the surveillance team watching Chanowski's rental house. Detective, we've got movement. A car just pulled into the driveway, Minnesota plates. The driver matches Chanowski's description. Do not engage, Sarah ordered. Maintain visual surveillance only. I'm on my way. She arrived at the stakeout location within 10 minutes, parking 3 houses down from the Vaughns' property. Through binoculars, she could see Chanowski moving around inside the house, visible through the kitchen windows. He appeared to be unpacking groceries, going about ordinary domestic activities, as if he had no idea that police had discovered his tunnel or his connection to the Peterson murders. He doesn't know we're onto him, Webb observed. If he'd seen the news coverage about finding the bodies, he wouldn't have come back. Maybe he's been somewhere without media access, Sarah suggested. Or maybe he's arrogant enough to think he covered his tracks adequately. They watched for another hour as Chanowski settled back into his routine. He made dinner, watched television, and at 8:30, he descended the basement stairs and didn't reappear. He's accessing the tunnel, Sarah said, her grip tightening on the binoculars. Webb, take your team through the front door. I'm going through the Peterson house to cut off his escape route through the tunnel. She radioed for backup and drove quickly back to the Peterson property, where crime scene tape still cordoned off the yard. The hidden door in Lily's closet remained open, and Sarah descended into the laboratory, with her weapon drawn, 2 uniformed officers following close behind. The basement was darker now, most of the forensic team's temporary lighting having been removed. Sarah clicked on her flashlight and moved through the laboratory to the preservation chamber. The hospital beds stood empty, the bodies having been transported to the medical examiner's office, but the room still carried the weight of death and obsession. She positioned herself at the tunnel entrance, listening for sounds of movement from the passage. Minutes ticked by in tense silence. Then she heard it. Footsteps, cautious and measured, approaching from the direction of the Vance house. A figure emerged from the tunnel, silhouetted against the dim light from behind. Robert Chanowski stepped into the preservation chamber, a flashlight in one hand and a leather satchel in the other. He froze when Sarah's flashlight beam hit his face. "Police, drop the bag and put your hands where I can see them." For a long moment, Chanowski didn't move. His expression was calm, almost resigned, as if he'd been expecting this encounter. Then, slowly, he set the satchel on the ground and raised his hands. "Detective Chen, I presume," he said, his voice cultured and measured. "I saw your press conference on the news. You've been very thorough in your investigation. Robert Chanowski, you're under arrest as an accessory to the murders of Helen, Emma, Jacob, and Lily Peterson." Sarah moved forward with handcuffs ready. "You have the right to remain silent." "Oh, I don't think I'll be remaining silent," Chanowski interrupted. "I've been waiting 30 years to tell this story properly. Michael may have bungled the execution, but the theory, the beautiful theory behind it all, that deserves to be understood." Sarah secured his wrists in handcuffs, while Officer Webb arrived through the tunnel from the Vaughn's house. They led Chanowski upstairs and out to a waiting patrol car. A crowd had gathered again, drawn by the police activity, and camera flashes lit up the night as Chanowski was placed in the back seat. At the police station, Sarah and Detective Liu conducted the interview in a stark room with concrete walls and fluorescent lighting. Chanowski sat calmly across the metal table from them, showing no signs of anxiety or remorse. He had waived his right to an attorney, insisting he wanted to explain himself immediately. "Let's start with your relationship with Michael Peterson," Sarah began, activating the recording device. "How did you meet?" "At the Consciousness Symposium in Chicago, 1987, Chanowski replied. "Michael presented a paper on chemical pathways to ego dissolution. It was amateurish in its execution, but brilliant in its core insight. He understood something that the academic establishment refuses to acknowledge, that human consciousness is not fixed, but infinitely malleable. So you decided to help him experiment on his own children," Liu said flatly. "I provided guidance," Chanowski corrected. "Michael had the subjects and the motivation, but he lacked the theoretical framework to properly structure his research. I helped him understand the protocols, the measurements that would be necessary to document the transition." "The transition to what?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. Chanowski leaned forward, his eyes bright with the same fervor she had seen in Michael's journal entries. "To pure consciousness, detective, freed from the limitations of individual ego, from the prison of singular perspective." Michael called it transcendence, but it's more accurate to call it dissolution, the breaking down of the barriers between self and other, between mind and mind. "You're describing death," Sarah said. "You helped Michael murder his family." "I helped him free them," Chanowski insisted. "The compounds we developed were meant to ease the transition, to make the dissolution process peaceful. But Michael rushed the timeline. He became unstable after the school board investigation, paranoid that they were going to discover the laboratory. He administered the final compound before it was ready, before we had properly prepared the subjects." Sarah felt revulsion rising in her throat. Chanowski spoke about the Peterson children as if they were laboratory specimens rather than human beings. "Why did you maintain access to the house all these years? What were you doing in that tunnel?" For the first time, Chanowski's calm facade cracked slightly. "Michael's notes," he said quietly. "His research represented decades of work. I couldn't let it be lost when the house was demolished. I've been digitizing everything, preserving his legacy." "His legacy of murdering children?" Liu demanded. "His legacy of pushing beyond the boundaries of accepted science," Chanowski replied. History is full of pioneers who were condemned in their time, but vindicated by future generations. Michael understood that consciousness is the final frontier, the only mystery that truly matters. Sarah opened the leather satchel they had confiscated from Chanowski. Inside were USB drives, notebooks, and a laptop. What's on these drives? Michael's complete research archive, Chanowski said. Videos, chemical formulations, test results, everything necessary to continue the work. Continue it with who? Sarah asked sharply. Were you planning to find new subjects? Chanowski smiled, a cold expression that didn't reach his eyes. You're asking the wrong questions, Detective. You should be asking whether Michael and I were the only ones conducting this research. You should be asking how many others attended that symposium in Chicago. How many others share our vision of human potential? The implication hung in the air like a threat. Sarah exchanged glances with Detective Liu, both of them realizing that the Peterson case might be just one node in a larger network of like-minded individuals conducting similar experiments. Give me names, Sarah demanded. If there are others doing this, tell me who they are. Chanowski leaned back in his chair, his smile widening. I think that's a conversation I'd like to have with my attorney after all. Detective Chen, I believe you'll find that this story is far from over. Michael Peterson's name will be remembered, but not as a murderer. As a visionary who dared to ask the questions everyone else was too afraid to contemplate. The interview ended there, Chanowski refusing to speak further without legal representation. As officers led him to a holding cell, Sarah reviewed the contents of the USB drives with Diane Cho. What they found confirmed her worst fears. The drives contained not only Michael's research, but correspondence with at least a dozen other individuals, all discussing similar experiments, sharing theories and methodologies. The network spanned multiple states and included people from various professions: doctors, chemists, psychologists, even a few academics who had maintained their university positions while conducting unauthorized research on the side. This is massive, Diane said, scrolling through email chains that dated back years. This isn't just about the Peterson family anymore. This is an organized network of people experimenting on vulnerable populations. Sarah contacted Chief Torres immediately, briefing him on the scope of what they had uncovered. Within hours, the FBI was involved, agents arriving to take custody of Chanowski and begin the process of identifying and locating the other members of the network. As the case expanded beyond her jurisdiction, Sarah found herself thinking about the Peterson family, about the lives that had been stolen by men who viewed human beings as experimental subjects in their quest for scientific recognition. Carol deserved to know that justice was being pursued, not just for her sister and nieces and nephew, but for potentially dozens of other victims who had suffered at the hands of this network. The FBI's involvement transformed the investigation from a local cold case into a federal priority. Special Agent Jennifer Hartley, a specialist in organized criminal networks, established a task force headquarters in Cedar Falls, coordinating efforts across multiple states to identify and apprehend the members of what she termed the Consciousness Project, the name several members had used in their correspondence. Sarah remained involved as the local liaison, her intimate knowledge of the Peterson case proving invaluable as agents worked to understand the full scope of the network's activities. Over the following weeks, a disturbing picture emerged. The symposium in Chicago, in 1987, had been organized by a fringe group calling themselves the Institute for Consciousness Research. While most attendees were legitimate academics interested in psychology and neuroscience, a small subset had used the gathering to network with others who shared their willingness to cross ethical boundaries in pursuit of knowledge. Michael Peterson and Robert Chanowski were part of this subset, but they weren't the only ones. FBI agents identified 15 individuals who had maintained active correspondence about conducting experiments on human subjects without consent. Of those 15, 7 were confirmed to have acted on their theories. In Oregon, a psychologist named Dr. Margaret Voss had been administering experimental compounds to patients at a private psychiatric facility, documenting their responses under the guise of legitimate treatment. 4 patients had died under suspicious circumstances, their deaths attributed to complications from their underlying mental illnesses. In Texas, 2 brothers who owned a nursing home had been experimenting on elderly residents with advanced dementia, believing that the degradation of their cognitive function made them ideal subjects for testing consciousness-altering substances. At least 12 residents had died prematurely, their deaths explained away as natural consequences of age and disease. Each case followed a similar pattern: vulnerable victims, isolated settings, and perpetrators who genuinely believed they were conducting legitimate scientific research rather than committing murder. They had convinced themselves that the pursuit of knowledge justified any means, that the victims' lives were already diminished in value by age, illness, or dependence. Sarah attended the task force briefings, listening as Agent Hartley detailed the arrest operations being conducted simultaneously across the country. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering, made more horrifying by the banality of the perpetrators. These weren't cartoonish villains, but educated professionals who had rationalized their way into monstrous acts. The Consciousness Project operated as a loose network rather than a formal organization, Hartley explained during one briefing. They communicated primarily through encrypted email and occasional in-person meetings, disguised as academic conferences. Michael Peterson was actually one of the more extreme members, one of the few who experimented on his own family, rather than on strangers. What was their endgame? Sarah asked. What did they think they would accomplish? Hartley pulled up a document on the projector, an essay written by one of the network's founding members. They believed they were on the verge of a breakthrough in understanding consciousness itself. They thought that by carefully documenting the dying process, particularly deaths induced by specific compounds, they could map the transition between life and death, between individual consciousness and whatever lies beyond. And when they inevitably failed to find anything, Detective Liu asked, they interpreted the failures as methodological problems rather than fundamental flaws in their premise, Hartley replied. Classic pseudoscience. When reality doesn't match the theory, they adjusted their methodology and tried again, rather than questioning whether the theory itself was wrong. As the arrests proceeded, Sarah focused on building the case against Robert Chanowski. He had been charged with 4 counts of accessory to murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and illegal human experimentation. His attorney had entered a plea of not guilty, arguing that Chanowski had been merely a theoretical advisor to Michael Peterson and had no direct role in the deaths. Sarah knew that conviction would be challenging. The video evidence showed Chanowski in the laboratory with the Peterson children, but he had never personally administered any compounds or physically restrained any of the victims. A skilled defense attorney could potentially argue that he was a passive observer, documenting Michael's work, but not actively participating. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Patricia Gomez, the medical examiner, called Sarah with findings from her analysis of the preserved bodies. I've identified the compound that killed the Peterson family, she said. It's a synthetic alkaloid, extremely sophisticated in its design. The formulation requires very specific chemical knowledge to produce. Could Michael Peterson have created it alone? Sarah asked. Not based on his background, Gomez replied. Michael was a high school chemistry teacher with a bachelor's degree. This compound required graduate-level organic chemistry knowledge and access to precursor chemicals that are tightly controlled. Someone with pharmaceutical industry connections would have needed to be involved. Chinovsky was a pharmaceutical sales rep, Sarah said, pieces clicking into place. He would have had access to precursor chemicals and the knowledge to synthesize complex compounds. Exactly. And I found something else interesting in Michael's laboratory notes. The handwriting changes between entries. Some of the technical formulations are written in a different hand than Michael's journal entries. Sarah requested samples of Chinovsky's handwriting from his rental application and employment records. A forensic document examiner confirmed that the technical notations in Michael's lab notebooks matched Chinovsky's handwriting. He hadn't just advised Michael theoretically. He had been directly involved in creating the compounds that killed the Peterson family. Armed with this evidence, Sarah met with the prosecutor, District Attorney Karen Walsh, to discuss the strengthened case. This proves Chinovsky wasn't just a passive observer, Walsh said, reviewing the forensic reports. He created the murder weapon, so to speak. That makes him directly culpable. The trial date was set for 6 months out, giving both sides time to prepare. In the meantime, Sarah had one more responsibility to fulfill. She met with Carol Hoffman at a quiet cafe, away from the media circus that still surrounded the case. Carol had aged visibly in the weeks since the discovery, the weight of 30 years of uncertainty replaced by the heavier burden of confirmed tragedy. But there was also a sense of peace in her demeanor, the relief that comes from finally knowing the truth, however painful. "I've been thinking about Helen," Carol said, stirring her coffee absently. About the moment she realized what Michael had done. The terror she must have felt, knowing her children were in danger, and she couldn't save them. Sarah reached across the table and squeezed Carol's hand. The toxicology reports suggest the compound worked quickly. There wouldn't have been much suffering, physically at least. "That's something," Carol said quietly. Michael loved them, in his own twisted way. He was sick, his mind broken by delusion. But those others, the ones in the network, they were just evil. They knew exactly what they were doing. "They'll all be held accountable," Sarah promised. "The FBI is building cases against every member they've identified. Some will accept plea deals, but the major players like Chinovsky will go to trial." Carol nodded, then pulled out an envelope from her purse. "I've been going through old family photos, things I'd kept stored away because they hurt too much to look at. I found something I think you should see." She handed Sarah several photographs from Christmas 1991, 1 year before the Petersons' final holiday. The family was gathered around their tree, faces bright with joy. Michael looked healthy and present, no sign yet of the obsession that would consume him. The children were laughing, Helen was smiling, and everything appeared normal. "That's what makes it so horrifying," Carol said. "From the outside, they were a perfect family. No one suspected the darkness that was growing in Michael's mind, the monster he was becoming." Sarah studied the photos, thinking about all the warning signs that had been missed or dismissed. Michael's increasingly erratic behavior at school, his growing isolation, his obsessive interest in consciousness research. Individually, none of these raised red flags, but together they painted a picture of a man spiraling toward catastrophe. "The school board was investigating him," Sarah said. "If they had acted more quickly, if they'd terminated his employment sooner, maybe he wouldn't have felt so desperate to complete his experiments." "Or maybe he would have done it anyway," Carol replied. "We can't know. All we can do is honor Helen and the children by making sure their story is told truthfully, by making sure something this horrific never happens again." As they parted, Sarah felt the weight of that responsibility. The Peterson case had become more than just solving a 30-year-old mystery. It had exposed a network of individuals who believed themselves above ethics and the law, who had caused immeasurable suffering in pursuit of knowledge that was always going to remain out of reach. 6 months passed in a blur of depositions, evidence review, and trial preparation. The media attention never fully subsided, though it evolved from breathless coverage of the initial discovery to more analytical pieces examining how such a network could operate undetected for decades. True crime podcasts dissected every aspect of the case, and amateur investigators flooded the police tip lines with theories that ranged from insightful to absurd. Sarah spent most of her time working with the prosecution team, helping them understand the physical evidence and the timeline of events. The case against Robert Janowski was strong, built on multiple pillars. The forensic handwriting analysis proving his direct involvement in creating the lethal compounds. The video evidence showing him in the laboratory with the Peterson children, his own admissions during the initial interview, and the testimony of other network members who had agreed to cooperate in exchange for reduced sentences. The trial began on a cold Monday morning in October, almost a year after Sarah had first walked through the door of the Peterson house. The courthouse was packed with media, true crime enthusiasts, and family members of other victims whose cases had been connected to the Consciousness Project network. Carol Hoffman sat in the front row behind the prosecution table, her presence a quiet reminder of what this trial was truly about. Robert Janowski entered the courtroom in a suit and tie, his appearance professional and unremarkable. He had lost weight during his incarceration, and his hair had gone completely gray, making him look older than his 54 years. He moved with the same calm confidence Sarah had observed during his arrest, as if he were attending an academic conference rather than facing trial for murder. The prosecution's opening statement, delivered by District Attorney Karen Walsh, was direct and damning. She laid out the timeline of the Consciousness Project, from its origins at the 1987 symposium to the Christmas Day murders of the Peterson family. She described Janowski's role not as a passive advisor, but as an active co-conspirator who had provided the means and methodology for Michael Peterson's crimes. Robert Janowski created the poison that killed 4 innocent people, Walsh told the jury. He mixed the compounds, he tested them, and he documented their effects. As Helen, Emma, Jacob, and Lily Peterson died, he didn't wield the syringe himself, but his hands are no less bloody for that. The defense attorney, a sharp woman named Rebecca Torres, countered with a strategy that attempted to shift all culpability onto Michael Peterson. My client was a researcher, not a murderer, she argued. He believed Michael Peterson was conducting theoretical work, documenting effects rather than causing deaths. When he realized what Michael had actually done, he was horrified and withdrew from any involvement. The first week of testimony focused on establishing the relationship between Janowski and Michael Peterson. FBI agents testified about the network's communications, presenting emails and documents that showed years of collaboration. Sarah took the stand on the 4th day, walking the jury through the discovery of the hidden laboratory and preservation chamber. When I found the tunnel connecting the 2 properties, Sarah testified, I realized someone had been accessing the Peterson house regularly, even though it had been empty for 30 years. That someone was Robert Janowski, who rented the house behind the Petersons specifically to maintain access to Michael Peterson's research. The defense cross-examined aggressively, trying to establish that Sarah couldn't prove when the tunnel had been created or who had used it most recently. But the dust pattern analysis and the fresh oil on the steel door's hinges supported the prosecution's timeline. The second week brought more damaging testimony. Dr. Patricia Gomez explained the sophisticated nature of the compound that had killed the Peterson family, emphasizing that its creation required expertise beyond Michael Peterson's educational background. The forensic document examiner walked the jury through the handwriting comparison, showing side-by-side examples of Chanowski's writing and the technical notations in Michael's laboratory notebooks. But the most powerful testimony came from Dr. Margaret Voss, the Oregon psychologist who had been arrested as part of the Consciousness Project sweep. She had accepted a plea deal in exchange for her cooperation and now sat in the witness box, looking diminished and haunted by her own crimes. Robert Chanowski was the network's chemist, she testified, her voice barely above a whisper. He created compounds for several of us, customized to our specific research needs. He didn't just advise us theoretically. He provided the tools we used to conduct our experiments. The defense tried to discredit Voss, pointing out that she had every incentive to shift blame onto Chanowski to secure her own plea deal. But her testimony was corroborated by emails and shipping records showing Chanowski had sent chemical compounds to her and other network members. The prosecution's case concluded with the videotapes from Michael's laboratory. The jury watched, many with visible discomfort, as the footage showed Chanowski actively participating in the experiments on the Peterson children. In one particularly damning clip from November 1992, Chanowski could be heard instructing Michael on proper dosage calculations, his voice clinical and detached, as Emma Peterson lay restrained and sedated on the gurney. The defense called only 3 witnesses, a psychiatrist who testified that Chanowski showed no signs of psychopathy or sadistic tendencies, suggesting his involvement was purely intellectual rather than criminal. A colleague from his pharmaceutical sales career who described him as professional and ethical. And Chanowski himself. Taking the stand was a calculated risk, but Chanowski seemed eager to explain himself. Under his attorney's gentle questioning, he presented himself as a misguided idealist who had been drawn into Michael Peterson's delusions without fully understanding where they would lead. "I thought we were engaged in theoretical research," Chanowski testified. Michael presented his work as carefully controlled experiments with willing adult subjects. "I didn't know he was using his own children. When I finally saw the videos showing children, I was horrified and immediately severed contact with him." But this testimony fell apart during Walsh's cross-examination. She confronted Chanowski with his own emails, messages where he specifically referred to the young subjects and discussed the advantages of using children because their developing brains would show effects more clearly than adult subjects. "You knew they were children, didn't you, Mr. Chanowski?" Walsh demanded. Chanowski hesitated, his calm facade cracking. The terminology was, "It was scientific shorthand. I didn't mean," you wrote in an email, dated October 1992. The younger subjects show remarkable plasticity. Michael's access to developing minds is providing data we could never obtain through adult subjects. You wrote that, didn't you? Yes, but... And you wrote it just 2 months before those younger subjects, before Emma, Jacob, and Lily Peterson were murdered with compounds you created. Chanowski's composure shattered. For the first time since his arrest, emotion broke through his clinical detachment. "I didn't mean for them to die," he shouted. Michael was supposed to be documenting responses, not administering lethal doses. He went off protocol. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, and the judge called for order. Walsh let the outburst hang in the air for a long moment before continuing, her voice quiet and deadly. "So, you knew the children were being experimented on. You created the compounds used in those experiments. You provided instructions on dosage and administration. And you maintained access to the laboratory for 30 years after their deaths to preserve Michael Peterson's research. Is that correct? Chanowski's attorney objected, but the damage was done. The jury had seen behind his carefully constructed facade to the man who had enabled the murders of 4 people in the name of pseudoscientific research. The closing arguments were brief. Walsh reminded the jury that accessory to murder didn't require Chanowski to have personally killed anyone, only to have knowingly assisted in the crimes. The defense argued that Chanowski's intellectual collaboration with Michael Peterson, while ethically questionable, didn't rise to the level of criminal culpability. The jury deliberated for 2 days. Sarah spent that time in her office, unable to focus on other work, checking her phone obsessively for updates. Carol called her twice each day, her anxiety palpable even through the phone. On the afternoon of the second day, Sarah's phone rang. "We have a verdict," the clerk informed her. The courtroom was packed again as the jury filed in. Sarah watched their faces, trying to read their expressions, but they maintained the carefully neutral demeanor that jurors were instructed to adopt. The forewoman, a middle-aged teacher, stood when the judge asked if they had reached a verdict. "We have, Your Honor. On the count of accessory to the murder of Helen Peterson. How do you find?" "Guilty." Carol gasped beside Sarah, her hand flying to her mouth. The forewoman continued through all 4 counts. "Guilty, guilty, guilty, guilty." Chanowski's expression remained neutral, but Sarah saw his hands tremble slightly as he gripped the edge of the defense table. Sentencing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. During that time, the FBI completed its nationwide sweep of Consciousness Project members. In total, 19 people were arrested and charged with crimes ranging from illegal human experimentation to murder. Several cases were still being built, but the network had been effectively dismantled. On sentencing day, Carol was given the opportunity to address the court. She stood slowly, her prepared statement clutched in trembling hands, but when she began to speak, she set the paper aside and spoke from her heart. "My sister Helen was the kindest person I've ever known," she said, her voice strong, despite tears streaming down her face. She dedicated her life to caring for children as a pediatric nurse. She loved her own children with a fierceness that was beautiful to witness. And she was betrayed by the man she trusted most, aided by a man who saw her babies as nothing more than test subjects. She turned to face Chanowski directly. "You can't give them back to me. You can't undo 30 years of grief and unanswered questions, but you can rot in prison, knowing that the world sees you for what you really are. Not a scientist or a researcher, but a monster to you who helped murder children in the name of knowledge that was never real to begin with." The judge sentenced Robert Chanowski to 4 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole. As officers led him from the courtroom, he turned once to look at the gallery, his eyes searching for something, understanding perhaps, or vindication. He found neither. Sarah walked out of the courthouse with Carol, the autumn sun breaking through clouds that had threatened rain all morning. Media cameras captured their emergence, but Sarah had no statement prepared. The verdict spoke for itself. "Thank you," Carol said quietly, gripping Sarah's hand, "for never giving up, for bringing them home." Sarah nodded, unable to speak, past the lump in her throat. She thought about the photographs on her desk, the images of a family frozen in time, and she thought about how justice, while necessary, could never truly heal the wounds left by such profound loss. But it was something. After 30 years of silence, it was finally something. 3 years After Robert Chanowski's conviction, Sarah Chen stood in the cemetery where the Peterson family had finally been laid to rest. A memorial stone, simple and elegant, bore their names and the inscription chosen by Carol. Together in life, together in peace. The house on Maple Ridge Drive had been demolished shortly after the trial concluded, the lot cleared and left empty at Carol's request. She had purchased the property to ensure it would never be developed, never become someone else's home, carrying the weight of what had happened there. Instead, she had donated it to the city to become a small memorial park, a quiet space with benches and trees where people could come to reflect. The Consciousness Project case had led to broader reforms. Universities and research institutions had implemented stricter oversight of experimental protocols, and Congress had passed legislation increasing penalties for illegal human experimentation. The case had become a touchstone in discussions about research ethics, a cautionary tale taught in medical schools and psychology programs across the country. Sarah had been promoted to captain of the detective division, her work on the Peterson case earning recognition beyond Cedar Falls. But she still thought about the family often, still wondered what might have been if someone had recognized Michael Peterson's descent into madness early enough to intervene. She wasn't alone at the cemetery. Carol visited regularly, keeping the memorial stone clean and leaving fresh flowers. She had established a foundation in Helen's name, funding mental health resources and research ethics oversight. It was her way of ensuring that her sister's death and the deaths of Emma, Jacob, and Lily meant something beyond tragedy. "I dream about them sometimes," Carol had told Sarah during one of their occasional coffee meetings. "But not nightmares anymore. I dream about Christmases before it all went wrong, about Helen laughing in the kitchen and the children opening presents. I dream about the family they were, not the way they died." Sarah placed a small bouquet at the base of the memorial stone, white roses that Helen had apparently loved. The inscription caught the afternoon light. Together in life, together in peace. It wasn't perfect closure. Closure was a myth Sarah had learned over her years in law enforcement. The wounds left by violent death never fully healed. But time and justice could transform raw grief into something more bearable, could allow survivors to remember love alongside loss. As she walked back to her car, Sarah's phone buzzed with a message from the FBI. Another member of the Consciousness Project network had been located in Europe, extradition proceedings beginning. The case, in some ways, would never be truly closed. But the Peterson family could finally rest, their story told, their suffering acknowledged, and their memory preserved, not just as victims, but as the people they had been. A chemistry teacher who loved corny jokes, a nurse with endless compassion, a teenager with medical school dreams, a boy who loved stars, and a girl whose gap-toothed smile had once lit up every room she entered. The snow was beginning to fall as Sarah drove away from the cemetery, light flakes that caught the late afternoon sun. She thought about that Christmas morning 30 years ago, when Michael Peterson had looked at his family gathered around the tree and decided their lives were worth less than his delusions. She thought about all the other families who had suffered at the hands of the Consciousness Project network, victims whose stories were still being uncovered, whose justice was still being sought. But mostly she thought about Helen Peterson's sister, standing in the rubble of a demolished house, finally able to say goodbye after 3 decades of not knowing. That was what the work meant, Sarah reflected. Not closure, but knowledge. Not healing, but truth. Not restoration of what was lost, but accountability for those who had done the taking. The Peterson house was gone now, reduced to memory and official records. But the family it had contained, the lives it had witnessed, and the terrible secrets it had held, those would endure, not as a mystery anymore, but as a reminder that beneath the surface of ordinary life, darkness could grow if left unchecked. That vigilance, compassion, and the courage to question what seemed normal were not just virtues, but necessities. As Sarah pulled onto the highway, heading back toward the police station and the stack of case files that always awaited her attention, she allowed herself a moment of gratitude for Carol Hoffman's persistence in demanding that final walkthrough of the house, for the demolition that had forced the discovery before the evidence was lost forever, for every small decision and coincidence that had finally brought the truth into the light. The Christmas vanishing, as the media had dubbed it, was solved, but its lessons about the dangers of unchecked obsession, about the vulnerability of those we're supposed to protect, about the importance of questioning authority and trusting instinct when something feels wrong, those lessons would echo forward, shaping how future investigators approached similar cases, how institutions monitored their researchers, how communities watched for warning signs of the monsters who hid in plain sight. Carol had been right. Helen and her children deserved to be remembered, not just as victims, but as the people they had been, full of life and love and potential. Their story was tragic, but it was also a call to action, a reminder that justice, while it could never undo harm, could at least ensure that harm was acknowledged, perpetrators held accountable, and future victims, perhaps protected. Sarah thought of the photographs still in her office, the Peterson family smiling for the camera one final Christmas before everything ended. She thought of the blue and red lights reflecting off snow on that first night she'd visited the house, of the moment she discovered the hidden door, of the long chain of evidence and testimony that had finally brought Robert Janowski to justice. And she thought of the memorial stone in the cemetery, simple and dignified, marking the place where a family torn apart by one man's madness had finally been reunited in peace. It wasn't the ending any of them would have chosen, but it was, at least, an ending. After 30 years of questions, there were finally answers. After 3 decades of silence, the truth had finally been told. The snow continued to fall as Sarah drove through the gathering dusk, each flake catching the streetlights like stars coming down to earth. Somewhere behind her, the memorial park that had once been 1247 Maple Ridge Drive stood empty and quiet, waiting for spring to bring new growth. And in the cemetery, the Peterson family rested together beneath the stone that bore their names, their long nightmare finally over, their memory preserved not in mystery, but in truth. The case was closed, the family was home, and Sarah Chen, who had spent 3 decades of her career wondering what had happened to the family that vanished on Christmas Day, could finally turn the page and face whatever mysteries tomorrow would bring, carrying with her the lessons learned from the house on Maple Ridge Drive and the terrible secrets it had held.